Dustborn may be one of the biggest gaming flops of all time, despite a lot of recent competition in that arena. Case in point, Ubisoft's Star Wars Outlaws is shaping up to be yet another AAA flop, as gamers, instead of playing it, are flocking to Black Myth Wukong, especially after it was criticized for its lack of diversity. While Firewalk Studios' Concord flopped so badly it just got willowed and pulled from the market. Yet its underperformance is nothing compared to that of Dustborn, from publisher Quantic Dream and Norwegian developer Red Thread Games. Dubbed by some as the wokest game ever made, it seldom has more than tens of concurrent players on Steam. Not tens of thousands, but literally tens. And at the time of recording this video, there were 17 concurrent players. I kid you not. While hardly anyone is actually buying or playing Dustborn, it is nonetheless a topic of conversation. Not because of its subject matter directly, mind you, but because it's a game that some have argued must have been made to sow discord in America, and which was funded by foreign entities, more specifically by official Norwegian and EU bodies. How could that happen? How could a Norwegian developer make a game like this?
Oh, and if we're lucky, we'll get to see Justice's tyranny up close, because nothing represents this republic more than the fascists in blue.
We're about to find out, so you better strap in, because in order to do so, we're gonna take a deep dive into the obscure Norwegian gaming industry, and the institution which funded Dustborn, an institution that I have been in contact with. Let's dive in. For those who came in late, let's begin with the basics on Dustborn. Dustborn is a single-player, story-driven action-adventure game taking place in the divided states of America, now called the Republic of America, for you know it's not a democracy, in an alternative timeline where America went all in on the dystopian direction the Harris campaign is telling you Trump is going to take the nation if re-elected. And it should be noted that development of the game began in 2017, in the aftermath of Trump winning the White House first time around, which the developers have stated the game is a reaction to. The game is said to be about the power of words, which is expressed through the power of cancellation, triggering, and perpetual victimhood.
Fella you're with, the black kid? Dresses like a writer? Does he know anything?
You are racist.
In short, the game is so overtly and over-the-top woke that some have suggested it may even be satired, though it's hard to be sure of that, as it's difficult to tell someone normal making ridiculous woke statements in jest to show the absurdity of it from someone actually woke being fully genuine. Predictably, the game flopped instantly and big time upon release, and while it did generate debate, it wasn't of the kind the publisher would have wanted. A review from the Norwegian national broadcaster NRK reveals the intention of the game, saying, "Red Thread Games is holding up a mirror to the world we live in and show it as an interactive future fable. The whole game is one continuous statement in a heated debate." Which I can only imagine must be a marketing point that is being revealed right there, indicating what the developers may have set out to do. But the reality is that they failed in this endeavor. There is no debate about the themes, messages, or morals of the game, however much the developers begged their community to engage in that instead of being angry at the game for existing. But if Dustborn holds up a mirror to anything, it is the flaws in Western gaming in general, and where Norway and the EU specifically are concerned, the flaws in the process of awarding development grants to video games, and nothing else. Because this begs the question, why would a Norwegian developer like Red Thread Games make something like this in the first place? Never mind that the story isn't set in Norway. Due to the difference in history and culture, the messaging isn't even applicable in Norway. So who are these developers to say anything on purely American conditions, let alone from such a hyper-partisan and ideologically driven perspective? I submit that in order to understand that, we have to follow the money trail and look at the funding. Dustborn also got an EU grant, but that is incidental. The primary source of funding was the Norwegian Film Institute, which first and foremost funds Norwegian films and TV series that meet certain cultural criteria, as well as foreign productions filming in Norway, then most notably major Hollywood productions. As part of their mission though, they also fund Norwegian video games. And let's bust one myth right away. While the money they allocated is ultimately taxpayer money, these are not state-funded projects per se, by which I mean no national politician decided we're gonna fund this project or that project. No, what happens is that the Film Institute is given a total pot of grant money from the Department of Culture, as well as guidelines for what kind of projects to fund, and then it's up to the Film Institute which productions to fund. And as I'll get back to later here, this grant money is a free gift that does not have to be repaid, for better and for worse. With that established, let's get back to Dustborn and why it was deemed worthy of funding. Dustborn has been described as a game so woke it might as well have been produced by Sweet Baby Inc. directly on behalf of the Harris campaign, and yet it is funded by the Norwegian Film Institute. Since I just so happen to be Norwegian, and full disclosure, I have even dabbled in the Norwegian gaming scene, and thus have had dealings with the Norwegian Film Institute before, I've been flooded with requests to find out how on earth a game like this could have been funded by Norway of all places. And so I reached out to Kaja Hensch Dyrli, who is the head of the video game section of the Norwegian Film Institute. After a brief phone call, she agreed to answer some questions by email. So to avoid any chance of misrepresentation, here's how we're going to do this. First, I'm going to present my questions, and the answers I was given to them by the Norwegian Film Institute word for word. Then, based on what the Film Institute stated, we're gonna explore the unique quirks of the Norwegian gaming scene, in the process revealing why a project like Dustborn could be funded and made in Norway. By way of the pictured email, and you can use Google Translate to verify or just trust my translation, that is up to you, I asked, can you tell me a bit about the funding process in general, and what specifically made Dustborn receive funding, as the game cannot be said to be about either Norwegian society or culture? Which was answered in bolded. Applications for development grants are assessed by the Film Institute's Games Advisor, as well as an external panel consisting of experienced Nordic game developers. The panel assesses the artistic qualities, the developer's ability to complete production, as well as the market potential. All games that pass the culture test will be considered. In order to pass the culture test, the game has to pass 3 out of the 4 below criteria. Those 4 criteria, pictured below, read: the design document and/or literary presentation is written in Norwegian or Sami language. The game is in Norwegian or in Sami language. The game is focused on Norwegian or Sami language, culture or history, or on themes that are relevant for a Norwegian target group. And the game has a substantial contribution from creators or acting artists residing in Norway or another EEA country. The Film Institute concluded their answer with, Dustborn passed this test and therefore qualifies. That's good and well, but I didn't ask why it qualified. I asked why this actually received the funding, as opposed to all the other applicants that also qualified but which didn't receive any funding. And to give you a rough average statistic, only about 1 out of every 3 or 4 qualified applicants actually receive funding. Moving on to the next question I asked. The creators have stated that the game is a reaction to Trump being elected president. Critics, however, point out that the depiction of Trump's America has no grounding in reality whatsoever, but rather appears to be based on disinformation from his political opponents, and that the game therefore is propaganda. That on top of that, presents cancel culture as positive. What were the panel's thoughts on this and how the game would be received in the United States? To which the Film Institute replied, "The panel assesses the artistic qualities, the developer's ability to complete production, as well as the market potential. The panel and the Film Institute's games advisor considered this as a strong project that has qualified for grants on 3 occasions. The Norwegian Film Institute gives no directions for the content of the projects to which we provide grants, neither within games, movies, or series. Here, the developer has the artistic freedom and freedom of speech to create the game experience and story which is in line with their vision." Next, I asked, were there any directions or conditions for the grants to Dustborn, to which they answered, not beyond the requirements to all grant recipients. You can read more about those here, and then there's a link to perfectly fair conditions no company in somewhat working order should have any trouble upholding. Then I asked, more generally, is the commercial appeal of the game part of the consideration? Because again, I asked all these questions by email in one go before any answers were provided, so this was answered, yes, market potential is one of the assessment criteria for the panel. That means the game is assessed to have the potential to reach its defined target market. Dustborn is released by a recognized publisher, Quantic Dream, which has also made significant investments into the project. This has been done on the basis of the game's market potential. I followed that up with, is there any assessment of how the funded projects ended up succeeding financially after release? Which was answered, after games that received grants have been released, we will follow up to assess how they perform. I had one final question as well, but before we get to it, some basic context on the Norwegian gaming scene is needed. Norway has one major world-class game developer, Funcom, which is a publicly traded company. Then there's a couple of mini-majors, which are also self-sufficient, so nothing of what I'm about to say in the rest of the video applies to them. But it very much so concerns the rest of the scene, which is comprised of glorified indies, many of which have been in business for years, but only at the mercy of continuous grants from the Film Institute, as they don't earn enough from their games to remain operational. We'll get back to the implications of this, but that's all you need to know for now. And with that context established, my final question was, several Norwegian game developers, even after a decade or more in operation, are still completely dependent on grants from the Norwegian Film Institute to remain in business. Have you given any thought on how these companies can be supported to become commercially self-sufficient, so they no longer need any grants to remain in business? To which the answer was, the Norwegian Film Institute does not fund the company's operations, but individual projects. Public grants is one of multiple revenue streams for the companies receiving grants. The grant for the individual projects contributes towards building permanent competence and capacity, both within the companies and the industry as a whole, which again contributes to a more financially sustainable industry. This model also recurs in the Norwegian film industry. That then were the official answers provided to my questions. I have thoughts on them. Clearly, the head of the video game section of the Norwegian Film Institute chose to provide only the most generic of answers, and even non-answers for the most important questions, which is fine. They're under no obligation to do anything else, especially when they know any answer will be scrutinized. Still, from these answers, it's clear that the panel of Nordic industry professionals and the Film Institute's games advisor felt that Dustborn had sufficient artistic merit and commercial potential to warrant receiving funding, more so than statistically 3 or 4 other qualifying games which would have been turned down in favor of Dustborn. With that in mind, considering the instant worldwide commercial rejection of Dustborn and the ditto rejection of its artistic vision, I have to call into question how qualified this panel and this game's advisor really are. Oh, I'm sure they all have their resume in order, not disputing their merits, but from where I'm standing, the commercial response to this game and the instant aversion to it was entirely predictable, and if those on the panel didn't see that coming a mile away, then perhaps it should be questioned if they, resume aside, are too out of touch with actual gamers to serve on any such panel. It's no excuse that Quantic Dream and that EU fund saw some potential. That only means they're out of touch as well, and it doesn't change the fact that the Norwegian Film Institute panel thought there was a market here when there clearly wasn't. As far as I'm concerned, that calls all of their decisions into question. That's very bad news for the entire Norwegian scene, as this panel ultimately decides which Norwegian games get made, and for all intents and purposes, they were the ones that gave Dustborn the green light. And I'll circle back to Dustborn and how such a game could ever have come out of Norway to begin with, but in order to appreciate that, we have to look a little bit closer at the Norwegian scene and its fundamental dysfunction. I refer to the Norwegian gaming scene as that, because it really is more of a scene than a functional industry. Ignore Funcom and the other couple of sustainable mini-majors which operate at another level. This doesn't apply to them so much. But the rest of the scene are glorified indies, and the majority of them are not independently sustainable. Take away the funding from the Norwegian Film Institute, and I submit you could count the companies that would remain in business long-term on your fingers, and Red Thread Games wouldn't be among them, because their results, after 12 years in business, are quite weak. To be clear, there is a lot of talent in Norway, but there is a shortage of investors willing to invest in something as unconventional as gaming. That's the big difference between Norway in one end and neighboring Sweden and Denmark in the other. Swedish and Danish investors like to add some spice and cool stuff to their portfolio, which gives Swedish and Danish gaming startups the seed capital they need to make their first big game. Plus, they have an investor behind them that will push for commercial success. That's a good thing, because if the game is a hit, that will not just pay off for the investor, but fund the company's next game. And if that's successful, it will fund another 2 games, and so on and so forth. Which is how a gaming startup ends up as a commercially successful, viable game developer. And that's why you have a functional gaming industry and franchises like Minecraft, Battlefield, Candy Crush Saga, Hitman and many others coming out of Sweden and Denmark. Alas, Norwegian investors like to restrict their portfolio to IT, deep-sea engineering and pharmaceuticals, which means outside of the established majors like Funcom, Norwegian would-be developers and startups are shit out of luck. They are dependent on the Norwegian Film Institute for funding, which means they have to compete with everyone else for the limited grants available, which in and of itself wouldn't have been a bad thing if the Film Institute had helped push the games with the biggest commercial potential and set up the companies behind them for success and future financial independence. But that is not what is happening. I'm not necessarily blaming anyone in the Film Institute for the state of affairs of the would-be Norwegian gaming industry, as they merely carry out the mandate given to them by the Department of Culture. As we saw earlier in the video, the Film Institute doesn't fund any company's operations, but they do fund individual games, both for startups and established companies. And they have these canned rationalizations ready for why this is the right way to go, even though there is no evidence to support that. This began in 2008, when the then Minister of Culture took a look at the Swedish and Danish gaming industry and decided, we want some of that too, let's help our indies out. Sadly, they went about it the wrong way. Instead of acting like a Swedish or Danish private investor that will fund the company and its operations for the first few years until their first killer game is ready and released and the company starts earning money from international sales. Money that will fund future growth, which is how you set up a company for long-term growth and success. The Norwegian Film Institute just fund individual games that they deem worthy of funding, and they do so year after year for the same companies, but without ever focusing on making them self-sufficient. In October of last year, the Norwegian gaming publication Gamer took a look at the 2022 tax returns for the Norwegian gaming companies, which pretty much confirms everything I've laid out here. In this article, the manager at Krillbite Studios, one of the, if anything, more successful companies on the scene, told the publication, "We wouldn't have managed without the support from the Film Institute. We need a certain amount of people to make quality games that are attractive on the market, and it would be difficult for us to achieve our ambitions without that support." So the government wanted a thriving Norwegian gaming industry. But if taxpayer money is what's driving it, do they really have one? And it didn't have to be this way. What the government, in my personal opinion, should have done was give the Film Institute a slightly different mission, namely provide the seed capital needed to keep the receiving company afloat until their first big game is out, when it's time to let them sink or swim. Instead, the Film Institute keeps on funding individual games the panel deems worthy, year in, year out, but without ever setting them up for independent success. There's a reason why a number of Norwegian game developers after dark and after a pint or two at the occasional developer meetups will refer to the Norwegian Film Institute as welfare for game developers. But it gets even worse. I submit that as of right now, it is a system that practically encourages producers like schemes. You won't get rich, and you won't have independent success, but if you can hone in on the right artistic merits the panel will appreciate, you'll remain in business and get a steady paycheck for the next couple of years. To wit, I've heard circumstantial tales of a few Norwegian games that were made not because the developers necessarily believed the market would respond to them upon release, but because they believed the panel at the Film Institute would respond to them when grants were allocated, and they needed those grants in order to stay in business in the short and medium term. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that someone in Red Thread Games decided Dustborn has so much virtuous artistic merits that the Film Institute has no choice but to approve. No, far from it. For all I know, the people behind the game are really so deranged that they genuinely believed Dustborn was something profound that gamers everywhere would respond to. Or maybe it really is one big satire. I won't pretend to know. What I am suggesting though is that regardless of the motivation behind Dustborn, that game, which has no discernible audience or commercial appeal anywhere on the planet, could only have been made in a system that artificially keeps companies afloat by picking up the tab for project after project, with no end goal of those companies ever being able to sustain themselves without support. Case in point, since they'll earn a mere pittance on Dustborn, Red Thread Games will have to apply for yet another grant from the Film Institute to stay in business and produce another game, which indeed they already have. Last fall, their upcoming Project M was awarded 2.3 million Norwegian krona, roughly $200,000, and they will probably apply for and receive even more support for it before it's released, at which point it will likely underperform as well, thus repeating the cycle. All the way until the Norwegian government starts asking the Film Institute what they have to show for the millions upon millions spent trying to kickstart a viable Norwegian gaming industry for nigh on 2 decades now. Anyway, there you see the gist of how Dustborn was funded. It wasn't anything more nefarious than that. So, what do you think? Was my taxpayer money well spent? Let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comments.